Hi, I'm Erica of Grapefruit and Gardenia Designs and the Knit Kind podcast. Welcome to today's episode. I am wearing the Summer Sky Shawl by Woolenberry, Janina Kallio. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It is knitted in the Alpaca Yarn Company Maraquita yarn, which is 50% alpaca and 50% tencel. It is fiber from Peru and hand-dyed in Pennsylvania. I love this yarn for shawls. It is incredibly soft. It has beautiful drape. I looked it up. It was my second shawl I think that I ever made. So it does have lace work in it, eyelets, and I do block the heck out of it, and it blocks beautifully. It also, I was looking recently, and it is listed as a 4-ply yarn, which at the time I knitted this, I probably wouldn't have even looked at. Maybe for more lace using a 2-ply, but it's a gorgeous yarn that I've used for other shawls that don't have a ton of lace work, and I just love how it drapes. So highly recommend that. Today I want to talk a little bit about stranded colorwork. In my first episode, showed you intarsia sweaters that originally inspired me to knit, and I mentioned how since then my taste has evolved a bit and I really prefer stranded knitting. So I thought I would show you how that journey started and a few tips I've learned from different projects, and just share that with you today. I first learned to knit colorwork, stranded colorwork, at a workshop in Melrose, Massachusetts, at what was my local yarn store before I moved, and it was called Lucky Cat Yarns. It's actually just rebranded as Sit and Knit, but it is still there. And there was a workshop offered from a designer. This was long before I designed, and she offered a stranded colorwork workshop with her own pattern. And I don't think you had to, but most of us did buy her yarn as well. She's an independent dyer as well as made some designs. So this is the cowl. It is called the Hygge Holidays Cowl, and it's from November 2019. It's published by Campfire Knits, and the dyer's name is Kara. See, I'm getting the glare again, and I'm trying to move around. These colors that I knitted in were called Barnwood and Flannel, but I have since knitted one in Malabrigo Rios, and I used the Matisse Blue and the Natural White, and people have used a lot of times reds and white for the holidays. It is a free pattern. I think it's still free. It's available on Ravelry, and I know I've seen it, I think Eat Sleep Knit actually put it out last year through their email list. So what I wanted to share with you about this is a few things. Some of them are just interesting, or at least interesting to me. I hope they're interesting to you, and shows you, how I started and how I picked things up. So when I first took this class, the instructor was knitting two-handed. So she was throwing English style with her right hand, knitting continental, and I'm not actually sure if she was picking or using like a modified continental with her left hand. I am a continental-ish knitter. So what does that mean? So naturally I hold the yarn in my left hand, but I don't naturally do that picking where you would hold it over your finger and sort of pick it through. What I do is I actually do a style where I put the needle through and I still throw it around the needle, but I'm using my left hand. So when I first started this, I had tried a couple times to do the right-handed throwing, and I thought, my gosh, how does anybody knit this way? I can't possibly knit this way. I didn't have the dexterity at the time. So I was knitting holding both yarns in my left hand, which a lot of people will start, whatever your natural inclination is or the way you normally knit, holding both yarns that way. And there's nothing wrong with that, and you can do any kind of color work by doing that. There's, of course, as we've said before, many ways to achieve the same results. So some people can hold both yarns in the right hand, both in the left hand, use one of the ring guides where you put the yarn through. You can pick, you can throw. But how did I learn, and how did that happen? So I was carrying both yarns in my left hand. I would knit a stitch with whichever color was next, the bluish color or the brown. I would then drop that drop that piece of yarn, pick up the other one, knit that stitch for as many as it said. So there's a few things that I want to highlight about that. One, I felt like I had a little bit of an advantage because I was a continental-ish knitter. So I already was inclined to knit more loosely than most patterns or most pattern writers write for or knit themselves. And what I mean by that is often I would pick up a pattern and the recommended needle size would be a 6, I would use a 4. It would be an 8, I would use a 6. So I would have to size my needle down because the loops I was making over my needle were looser when I pulled them through. So I needed a smaller needle to make a stitch that was on gauge. If that's something you're interested in learning more about, please comment and I will do a whole other piece on gauge. But for now, that's what I wanted to share with you. And the reason I wanted to share that is one of the biggest challenges people have with stranded color work is making sure that their floats are loose enough across the back of the work so that their work doesn't pucker. So let me show you the inside of this cowl. These are the floats. You'll see that the brown yarn is pulled across the back when I'm knitting with the blue, and the blue is pulled across the back when I'm knitting with the brown. Now, if I look at this cowl, this has a good amount of stretch to it. And from this side, what that shows, this is of course a blocked piece that I've worn many times, but it creates a nice flat fabric. So you don't see a lot of puckering here. And also the floats aren't so loose that on the inside they're getting caught on things. So I would say I went through, and I think it actually says exactly in my Ravelry project, something like 11 or 14 rolls of color work, just doing that one color, drop it, the other color, drop it. And then I just put the yarn in each hand and I just very slowly and probably awkwardly at first started throwing with my right hand. Once I could do that, I really got in a flow, and that's why to this day, this is some of my favorite process knitting. So we'll also, I think in the future, talk about process versus product knitting, or maybe a little bit of both. But for me, the process of that throwing on each side is very meditative and soothing. And then because I love color and color work, I love seeing the pattern develop. And the other piece, and what I'm going to show you in this particular podcast, are a few of the sweaters I've made and the lessons I've learned. So I also want to share one of the lessons I learned with this cowl. And what happened is, as I went, being that kind of type A that we've talked about before, personality of a knitter, I would get to my beginning of round and I would say, my little tree isn't lining up just right, or my snowflake isn't lining up just right. And of course, at this point, I did understand the structure of knitting, but I hadn't done stranded color work. So what do I mean by that? Well, knitting in the round, which means I'm going around and around on a circular needle, I'm not knitting flat that's then going to have to be seamed, there is what we call in knitting a jog, and that is where the beginning and end of round come together. And I think the best analogy I've ever heard is if you think of a slinky, right? I think probably worldwide, most people know what a slinky toy is. And it's that idea that you've got a coil and that coil is going up and up and up, or down and down and down. But what you're not doing is you're not stacking a ring on top of each other with a beginning and an end that meet nicely together. So if you think about taking something like poker chips or ring toss game or anything round, donuts, stacking them on top of each other, that's one ring that closes and another ring that closes. And your knitting isn't doing that, because if it was, you would have to attach each ring together. What it's doing is creating a ring that goes on top and on top and on top. So where they meet, instead of coming together evenly, they're coming together like this. And normally in things like stockinette or reverse stockinette or any pattern that's creating what looks like a flat fabric, that doesn't matter. But when you're using different colors, be it just stripes or a motif, it does, because it's not going to quite align. So I saw that and I thought, well, what do I do? There's got to be a fix. Of course, there are many, many fixes. I'm going to share with you the title of an article that I often link to in my patterns now, or suggest to people if they'd like to learn more. It's from September of 2021. It is from Interweave, the magazine, or the online magazine, and it's an article called Correcting for the Jog in Stranded Knitting. It has both information about the why and then ways that you can correct that. So in my first project, this was from 2019, I hadn't read that article, and I simply did duplicate stitching. So I'll show you, it's almost indecipherable. I have to actually look quite hard for it. Okay, so here is my beginning of round from the inside, and I can find that because if you see here, I have sort of that hidden vertical of where I carried yarn up as opposed to carrying it around. And so if I look at this very spot and I turn it to the right side, you will see that you almost can't even tell where it is. If you look very closely, you're gonna see some stuff that maybe is not exactly aligned, but it's really hard to see. And the reason is I went and duplicate stitched. So from the right side of the work, if I had a brown where I wanted a blue, I would come over the top of that and just simply stitch from the front to make it the color I wanted, so that the motif was more coherent across the jog. And so the fact that I have to really look for it now reminds me that sometimes we finish these projects and we think it's not as perfect as we want it to be, and we just need to step back a little bit because chances are it's more perfect than we think. So that was my big takeaway from this first piece that I learned how to do. It was learning to do that two-handed knitting, which I'm happy to demonstrate in another video. It was, why was I not having some of the same tension challenges? So I won't say this was the one time that the continental-ish knitting was a benefit, but you know, there are certainly times like making socks where I have to work really hard at getting that tight gauge. And people who are English style just think, oh, well, that's, you know, just throw it around and put a smaller needle. And it's like, there's only so many small needles you can go to. But this time, having those looser floats by nature made it so that it wasn't really something I struggled with. I will say I do what a lot of people do as a way to even improve that more. For example, when you're doing the yoke of a sweater, because the difference is, this is pretty much all color work. Get it upside down. But when you're doing a sweater and you're going from color work to stockinette, now all of a sudden you have two different tensions potentially, and even more so when you're doing small circumference arm knitting. So what a lot of people will do, myself included, almost always, is I will size up a needle when I am working on the color work of the yoke, and then size back down a needle, or even two sizes sometimes, when I'm doing the stockinette body. And where that gets even a little bit more interesting is on the sleeves. So on the sleeves, oftentimes, and not always, and some people are completely the opposite, but many of us will knit more tightly when we're doing a smaller circumference. So you're doing a large, you know, body circumference, your knitting kind of relaxes, you're going around. It sort of matters how it's moving on your needles as well. We're doing a small circumference, there's something tighter about that. And it might depend on the method you're using. So DPNs, magic loop, small circumference needles, flexi flips, or something similar, it might all be a little bit different. But if we're truly knitting that small circumference, there's a decent chance it's going to be tighter. So two things, potentially size up for your color work, whether it's in your yoke or the bottom or the body of your sweater, potentially size back down when you're going to plain stockinette, and then when you're going to the sleeve, potentially size up regardless of whether there's color work. And if there's color work, think about how you want to do that. Are you sizing up for the sleeve and then up again for the color work, or just up once for the sleeve, including the color work, and so on? So those are a couple of tips thrown in there as we go. Okay, first lessons there. Well, after this, I moved to my first adult sweater. And this was not only my first adult sweater, my first Colorwork yoke sweater. There were a lot of things that I probably said at first, oh, never gonna knit in fingering weight yarn. How could anybody possibly do that? It would take forever. Never gonna knit a full adult size sweater. It'll take me a year. And yet, you know, I did obviously gain both more confidence and just desire to do those things that I didn't think I would probably ever do. So knowing that, I went for my first sweater to be short sleeved and cropped. And many of you know this pattern. It's the Soldotna, and it is by Caitlin Hunter of Boyland Knits. This is done in So Happy Jane yarn. Again, the yarn that I've mentioned before, hand-dyed in Idaho. And the other thing about doing a Soldotna crop or another short sleeve crop is, depending on your yarn budget, you know, a sweater quantity for short sleeve crop is a lot smaller than a sweater quantity for large sleeve, long sleeve, full length. So this actually, I knitted a hybrid size, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. This actually could be knitted with the 4 skeins just needed for the colors. So the only one that I did get extra just in case, but the full skein of the main color here, which is Beechwood. And I think actually a full skein of the Ross Poldark, which is one of my favorites. This deep, dark, mysterious, just like Ross, if you've watched the show, blue. And then we have, I think it was actually my new party dress. That's what I always call it, but maybe just party dress, and a color called Fog here. And the Fog is a very light blue with speckles. So those were the 4 colors. And what lessons did I learn from this? Well, this is less of a colorwork lesson and more of a sweater lesson, but I learned that looking at a schematic drawing of a sweater, I am not easily put into a box. And I think that's the case with many of us. And I had really no sense of how to go about this, but this pattern had amazing pattern support. So please keep in mind, anytime you're modifying a pattern, you may not get this level of pattern support, but through the Ravelry group and someone who assists with Caitlin's patterns, I learned, oh, I could just start a larger yoke, and when I separate for the sleeves, I'm going, and you know, sleeves being cap sleeves in this case, but it's the same with full length sleeves, I can separate so that I have more stitches on my sleeve, fewer on my body, and now I knit the body in the smaller size and the sleeve in the larger size. So that's what I chose to do on this particular one. There are, you know, many other ways that you can do it, but with a yoked sweater where your stitch count obviously matters a lot, not only for sizing, but for motifs and making sure they work together, that is one way you can do it. So that's something I learned, again, more about sweaters than color work, but I wanted to share that here. And if you like the show and tell, I will show you the inside of the sweater. So this, I will say, I just told you so much about sizing down needle size. Well, Caitlin Hunter must be similarly a loose knitter, because I think I actually sized up on this. And part of that was, I think the recommended needles were a 3 and a 5. I'd be curious to actually knit this in a 3 and a 5, because I probably could, but I think I knitted it in a 5 and a 7. So no hard and fast rules. Just because you always size down 2 needles, don't assume it's always going to be. This is the inside of this one. So you can see my floats. And it goes down the whole body. I'm pretty proud of the floats, but I'll show you the not so elegant part, because I think it's always good to be humble. This is my carrying the yarn. I've come a long way there with how I carry yarn vertically. But hey, it's not too bad, and it's right up the back. So the other things to mention here, I am a catch your floats kind of knitter. Not everyone is. Some people will have very long floats, and that again is that yarn that's traveling across the back that's not being knitted into a stitch at the moment. I like to catch them regardless of the weight of my yarn, almost every 3 stitches consistently. There's a couple of exceptions to that. They are mostly around where I'm catching it and if that might be visible from the front of the work, as well as a little bit with the weight. And sometimes I will catch a little more frequently or a little less frequently. And the other piece is when you have a motif that would require you, I'm trying to see if I can find one here. I think I can explain it without having necessarily having an example. If you're working something and let's say it's 6 stitches that you're floating across for multiple rows, you don't want to catch it in the same spot every time. So if it's 6 stitches, and normally I would knit 1, 2, 3, catch 1, 2, or you know what I'm saying. The next time, I don't want to do that same thing again, because then it will start to have more potential to show from the front. So if I have 6 stitches, maybe I'll do knit, knit, catch, knit, knit, catch. Maybe I'll do knit, catch, knit, knit, catch on the next row. Does that make sense? So that you're not having that float caught at the same point over and over again. There's nothing wrong if you do it. It just gives you a little bit more space for perhaps a look from the front that you're not as happy with. So if you're faced with that, that's what I would recommend. Let me see. I did make another Soldotna. I loved it so much. So this one I made full length and in fall colors. So this one is not cropped. I did need the extra body color here. But if you end up liking Colorwork, this is such a fun knit. And I don't say many things are a fast knit, but I can make a Soldotna crop for myself if I'm knitting on it a lot in 2 weeks, give or take, maybe 3, but there's not a lot of things I can do that with. So I wanted to share that, and now I'm going to get into a couple other things quickly, but I'm not going to show you every Colorwork sweater I've ever knitted, but I do think there are a couple things that have some interesting points to them. So let me show you those. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. I'm going to touch on some things again, where, as I've said before, I'm not an expert. I am gaining expertise, I'm gaining knowledge, and I think that is fun to share. But I've also learned through watching a lot of podcasts and attending a lot of knitting groups that the level of expertise you think other knitters have, they might not. And sharing your expertise, that's who you are, an expert in you and your experience. And so sharing those things doesn't mean someone can't tell you, oh, I do it differently, or, you know, I don't think that's quite right. That's all okay. Let's put it out there. And as I say, knit kindly, live kindly, and support each other, because this hobby, or for some people, profession, is something that we all love. And why not share and compare notes and learn from each other? So this sweater is called Aurealis. It is by Jen Steingass. And I show you this one for 2 reasons. It does have Colorwork down the sleeves. Let's see. I knitted this in Spincycle and on the round, everyday DK. I love it. The fit is incredible for me. So I know we all try to find the designers out there where we don't necessarily need to modify a lot, and they just fit, and this one is great for me. I show it for you quickly for 2 reasons today. One is we talked about hand spinning in the last episode, and a lot of her patterns are wonderful for hand spun yarn of your own, or yarn that has the hand spun look, whether it is hand spun or mill spun. But we've talked about the Making Tracks from Junction Fiber Mill. Spincycle, I think most knitters have heard of or seen, because it's so popular in so many designs. And then Feederbrook Farm, or, you know, Make My Heart Sing and go to your local fiber festival and find one that maybe we don't know yet. There are so many out there, and they're beautiful. And what you want is that longer change of the colors, because as we talked about also a little bit before, when you're doing a yoke, it is a much longer distance that the yarn has to travel. So if you don't want it changing horizontally, you want it changing vertically, you're going to need longer color changes. If you're working a sock, right, you can have shorter color changes because it's a smaller circumference. So I show you this for the hand spun color changing yarn, and also because, and let me show you up close, this is a superwash yarn. It has more of a muted color to it, or a matte tone to it, but it is a superwash yarn. And why am I pointing that out? Well, my next Colorwork tip or lesson is I showed you the Marshland that I had made for my son in the first episode. And I said, one of the things that I would do differently in the future is I used this Malabrigo Rios, which is a color I adore. And I love how it looks color-wise in the sweater. But I thought, oh, maybe I didn't make the best pairing. The weights worked, the color worked. But when you look at it closely, obviously there's a difference there. And at first I thought, oh, maybe superwash, non-superwash. It's more to it than that. And it's also more to it than woolen spun and worsted spun. And we talked about that a little bit. So it's certainly those two things are factors, but there are more factors than just that. So as you're learning to do color work, maybe you're working with your stash and you're trying to figure out what works, swatching is always a great option because you're going to catch these things earlier. And sometimes you just go for it and say, you know what, this is what I have and I'm going to do it and that's going to be fine. And other times you say, I think this one yarn I'm going to swap out because I love it, but I don't love it for this project. And so just quickly on that, what I mean by superwash isn't the only factor, is this orange here is also superwash. But see how this is on the round and this is everyday worsted, like my everyday DK, and see how it has more of a consistent feeling with the browns. And that has to do with color, because it's not just superwash, non-superwash. The other thing it's not just woolen spun, worsted spun, because again, you're gonna see that this Rios is worsted spun. Well, I think this one is too. It's smoother. It's just aesthetically a little bit of a different look. The Green Mountain Spinnery, which is the majority of this sweater, is both woolen spun and non-superwash, I think. I'm 99% sure. I'm sure it is. And so a lot of the more traditional, like the Icelandic sweaters you would see, or the traditional yokes, they are in non-superwash wool, and they're in a woolen spun. And that's so that the spaces in between really fill in. So you can do color work in superwash worsted spun, right? We've looked at many of those and it's beautiful. Your stitches are going to look more individual. So when you pull them, you're seeing the stitches and you'll even see the background, just kind of see through. And when you pull a woolen spun that is non-superwash, those fibers fill in more. And that's why traditionally, some people will stick with that because it fills in. So mistakes, if you will, they don't have to be mistakes, but just slight inconsistencies, they're gonna be more forgiving. And when you wash that sweater and you wear that sweater, it doesn't felt unless you put it in the washing machine, but it does start to have, they're sticky, they cling to each other. So it is a different look. So I wanted to show you that. And then I think for the last sweater I will show you today is when I made my own with the weekend wool, and I had already learned that lesson. I went ahead and I bought the whole weekend wool palette that I wanted to use. So these are all weekend wool by Green Mountain Spinnery. This is one of my favorite sweaters. I wear it all the time. I did make modifications to it, and those are all detailed in my Ravelry account. And it is air and weight. It is, it's light physically. I mean, it's not super light, but it's not as heavy as maybe a superwash would be because it's woolen spun. And I can wear this outside with a hat when I go to a festival or something and I'm totally warm. I don't necessarily need a jacket unless it's really cold. And I can wear it inside and I'm not dying sweating. This is really one of the wools that, you know, people rave about. Like, it's going to keep you warm when you want to be warm and not overheated when you don't want to be overheated. And I mean, look at this palette and how these work together. So I absolutely adore this one. And that is the, you know, last little lesson that I wanted to do on Colorwork today. I thank you for watching. As I've said midway through this, knit kindly, live kindly. You know, please find the joy in life and spread joy. And we need more of that in the world. So thank you for joining me here today. I look forward to another podcast soon and welcome your questions. Please subscribe if you enjoy this. And if you're on Ravelry, please look for our Knit Kind Ravelry group. Take care.